Good evening. Let's talk about a hard truth. After the age of 40, we inevitably start losing muscle mass. This isn't speculation, it's backed by data. By the time we reach our 70s or 80s, if we don't actively intervene, we could lose up to half of our skeletal muscle mass. This process is called sarcopenia. It's one of the most significant threats to our quality of life as we age. Here's the kicker: sarcopenia doesn't kill you directly, but it sets off a dangerous domino effect. This cascade often culminates in frailty, falls, hospitalization, a loss of independence, and eventually, premature death. So, what can we do about it? Let's start by acknowledging something most people don't realize until it's too late. We begin losing skeletal muscle after the age of 30, sometimes even earlier. This isn't a mere coincidence, nor is it exclusive to those who are sedentary or unhealthy. It's a universal biological process, age-related muscle loss, or sarcopenia. It's gradual, silent, and for most, goes completely unnoticed until it starts impacting everyday performance. The data is clear: muscle mass declines at roughly 1% per year starting in our 30s or 40s. Even more importantly, muscle strength decreases by about 2 to 3% annually. This means that by their 70s or 80s, many individuals may have lost as much as 40 to 50% of their peak muscle mass, and an even greater percentage of their strength. Why does this matter? Can't we just slow down as we age? The answer is a resounding no, especially if your goal is longevity with quality. That's the crucial distinction. The aim isn't just to live longer, it's to live better longer, and muscle is central to achieving that. Sarcopenia doesn't kill you outright, and that's part of its insidious nature. It's not like cancer or a heart attack, where the event is acute and immediate. Instead, sarcopenia initiates a chain reaction, a slow-motion system failure. It begins with subtle changes. You notice you don't stand up from a chair as easily, or you avoid carrying groceries upstairs. Then, your balance starts to waver, your steps become cautious, and you stop walking as far. You might eventually need help getting out of a car or bracing yourself to rise from the floor. Eventually, the muscle loss becomes so severe that your mobility is compromised, and with it, your independence. This is where the real consequences emerge. Reduced mobility leads to less physical activity, which in turn accelerates further muscle loss, creating a vicious cycle. The risk of falls increases sharply, and as numerous longitudinal studies have shown, falls in older adults often have devastating outcomes. The broader impact of muscle loss. A fall after the age of 70 can be catastrophic. Roughly 20 to 30% of older adults who fracture a hip will die within 12 months, and many more will never regain full independence. But muscle loss is about more than just strength and balance. Metabolically speaking, muscle is one of the most important organs in the body. Yes, organ. We often think of muscle as simply tissue that helps us move, but that's an outdated view. Skeletal muscle is the largest site of glucose disposal in the body. It acts as a sink for blood sugar, helping to regulate insulin sensitivity and overall metabolic health. When muscle mass declines, insulin resistance tends to rise. This helps explain why sarcopenia is associated not just with frailty, but also with metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even some cancers. Muscle also plays a critical role in immune function, hormone balance, and recovery from illness or injury. It serves as a reservoir of amino acids, which the body can draw upon in times of stress or trauma. Think of it this way: when you get sick, say, hospitalized with pneumonia, your body dramatically increases its protein demand. If you don't have adequate muscle to meet that demand, your system effectively cannibalizes itself. The result is a steep, sometimes irreversible, decline. Many older adults who never quite recover from a hospitalization or surgery are, in part, suffering from a catabolic crisis due to low muscle reserves. The good news: sarcopenia is modifiable. Now, here's the good news: sarcopenia is not inevitable. Or, more accurately, the process of aging is inevitable, but the outcome of muscle loss is modifiable. This is what I emphasize with patients: you cannot stop aging, but you can change how you age. Maintaining or even building muscle mass as you get older is entirely possible with the right interventions. However, there's a caveat: the window to intervene effectively starts closing earlier than most people realize. Waiting until you're 70 to think about strength training or protein optimization is like trying to start investing for retirement at 65. It's possible, but you've missed decades of compounding benefits. Ideally, you should begin your muscle preservation strategy in your 30s or 40s. But even if you're older, you can still make meaningful gains. The human body is incredibly adaptive when given the right stimuli. The stimuli for muscle preservation. So, what are those stimuli? There are two key factors: mechanical load and amino acids. Mechanical load means resistance training, lifting heavy things with proper form and progressive overload. This consistently challenges your muscles. Amino acids mean protein, particularly high-quality, leucine-rich protein that can effectively stimulate muscle protein synthesis. We'll delve deeper into the role of nighttime protein later, but for now, it's essential to understand that muscle preservation is an active process. You must give your muscles a reason to stay. If you don't, your body will deem them unnecessary, and they will disappear. This is a concept called use it or lose it physiology, and it applies especially as we age. Consider this: in a 10-day bed rest study of healthy older adults, subjects lost nearly 1.5 kilograms of lean mass and 15% of their leg strength in just 10 days. Imagine that kind of loss playing out slowly over 10 years. Now, imagine doing nothing to stop it. So, the key takeaway is this: muscle loss with age is not just a cosmetic issue, it is a medical issue, a longevity issue. It starts earlier and progresses faster than most people realize. But critically, it is also highly modifiable. If you begin now, today, you can build and preserve enough muscle to not only extend your life but dramatically improve its quality. Because in the end, the question isn't whether you'll live to be 90, the question is whether, when you're 90, you'll still be walking under your own power, living independently, and doing the things that make life worth living. And that begins with muscle. The inadequacy of just staying active. There's a widely held belief, particularly common among older adults, that as long as you're staying active, going for walks, maybe hitting the gym a few times a week, you're doing everything necessary to preserve your muscle mass. This belief is not only incomplete, it's dangerously misleading. Because the truth is this: exercise alone is not enough to maintain muscle as we age. Let me explain why. When we think about preserving lean mass, the first thing that comes to mind is usually strength training, and that's a good instinct. Mechanical tension, the load placed on muscle fibers during resistance exercise, is the primary trigger for muscle protein synthesis, MPS. Without that signal, the body has no reason to maintain muscle, it's energetically expensive tissue. So yes, resistance training is absolutely necessary. The crucial role of protein. But the signal alone isn't sufficient for the body to actually build or even preserve muscle in response to that mechanical load. It needs raw materials, and that means proteins, specifically essential amino acids, particularly leucine, which acts as the on switch for MPS via the mTOR pathway. This is where nutrition enters the picture. Most people, especially older adults, are chronically underconsuming high-quality protein. More importantly, they're not consuming it in the right way. The typical pattern looks something like this: a light breakfast, maybe toast or oatmeal, a moderate lunch, and then most of their protein comes in at dinner. That distribution is suboptimal for stimulating muscle synthesis throughout the day. Worse, many older adults don't hit the leucine threshold at any meal, especially not in the evening when muscle breakdown accelerates. Understanding anabolic resistance. Let's talk about that for a moment. Anabolic resistance. This is one of the central challenges of aging. As we get older, our muscles become less responsive to the same anabolic stimuli, both exercise and protein. So, while a 25-year-old might stimulate MPS with 20 grams of whey protein, a 70-year-old might need 35 to 40 grams of a leucine-rich protein to achieve the same effect. The implication here is profound. Not only do older adults need more protein, they also need it distributed intelligently, with a sufficient dose at every feeding to cross the threshold for synthesis. In fact, one of the biggest misconceptions is that total daily protein is all that matters. In reality, what matters more, especially for muscle preservation, is how you dose and distribute that protein throughout the day and how you align it with your exercise window. A 2015 trial demonstrated that evenly distributing protein, around 30 grams per meal across breakfast, lunch, and dinner, led to significantly higher 24-hour muscle protein synthesis, MPS, compared to a skewed distribution, even with the same total protein intake. Here's another critical layer: timing. Protein intake around your training window enhances the muscle building response. In younger people, there's a relatively wide anabolic window post-training. In older individuals, that window becomes narrower and more sensitive to nutritional support. This is why I recommend that my patients consume a robust, leucine-rich protein dose within 1 to 2 hours post-training and another before bed, which we'll discuss more shortly. The cost of undernourishment. But there's a deeper problem here, one that requires us to zoom out. Many people, especially as they age, start to prioritize calorie reduction or adopt diets that are low in protein by default, poorly constructed plant-based diets, for example. Now, I want to be clear, a plant-based diet can support muscle preservation, but it requires meticulous planning and usually higher total protein intake to compensate for lower bioavailability and leucine content. Most people don't do that. So, what's the cost? They lose muscle slowly and silently, and over time, they begin to experience the symptoms of undernourishment, slower recovery from workouts, more frequent injuries, declining strength, and impaired glucose control. These aren't normal parts of aging, these are signs of inadequate nutritional support for lean mass. Let's look at this from another angle. If I told you that you were slowly losing bone density, or red blood cells, or liver function, would you shrug and say, well, that's aging? Probably not. You'd ask, what could be done? Yet, with muscle, we tolerate an extraordinary level of loss, even when we have the tools to stop it. The prescription for muscle preservation. The prescription, again, is not complicated, but it requires consistency and intention. Engage in regular, progressive resistance training at least 2 to 3 times per week. Consume 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, depending on your level of activity and body composition. Distribute that protein across 3 to 4 meals, with a minimum of 30 grams per meal and at least 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per dose. Time protein consumption around your training sessions, particularly within 1 to 2 hours post-workout, and again before bed. It's also important to emphasize protein quality. Not all proteins are created equal. Animal-based proteins, dairy, eggs, meat, tend to have higher biological value and more favorable amino acid profiles. That doesn't mean plant-based proteins are ineffective, but it does mean you need more total volume and thoughtful combinations to achieve the same anabolic effect. This is where supplements can play a useful role, not as a crutch, but as a tool. A high-quality whey isolate post-workout and a slow-digesting casein protein before bed can make the difference between a catabolic overnight state and one that supports muscle repair. In summary, nutrition, and specifically protein intake, is not ancillary to muscle preservation, it's central. Exercise creates the signal, protein provides the building blocks. Without both, the system fails. It's like trying to build a house with blueprints but no bricks. You can have the plan, but nothing's going to hold up. Muscle preservation is a race against time, but it's a race you can win if you combine the right form of exercise with the right form of nutrition. One without the other is a coin toss, both together, that's strategy, that's medicine, that's longevity. There's a window of time each day when your physiology becomes markedly catabolic, meaning your body is more likely to break down tissue than build it. And it happens when most people assume everything is fine, during sleep. Now, let me be clear, sleep is not the problem. In fact, sleep is arguably the most important health behavior we engage in daily. But while sleep supports numerous regenerative processes, from memory consolidation to immune repair, it also introduces a prolonged period of fasting. And that fasting has very real implications for muscle metabolism, particularly in older adults. The overnight catabolic state. Let's look at the physiology. During the day, especially after meals and exercise, the body cycles through periods of anabolism, tissue building, where muscle protein synthesis, MPS, exceeds muscle protein breakdown, MPB. This is the ideal state, it's how we maintain or build muscle. But during overnight fasting, typically 7 to 9 hours without food, the balance shifts. Muscle protein breakdown exceeds synthesis, and the net result is a loss of lean tissue. In younger individuals, the body compensates fairly well. There's enough hormonal drive, testosterone, IGF-1, growth hormone, and sufficient muscle mass to buffer short periods of catabolism. But in older adults, especially those who already have reduced muscle reserves and lower anabolic hormones, this nightly breakdown becomes a significant contributor to chronic muscle loss over time. And here's where things get worse. Not only are older adults more vulnerable to overnight muscle catabolism, they're also less likely to recover from it. Why? Because of anabolic resistance, the reduced capacity of aging muscle to respond to protein and exercise. That means whatever muscle is lost overnight is not easily restored unless there's a strong, intentional anabolic signal the following day, one that most people fail to provide. So, every night, the body goes into a low-grade catabolic state, and without sufficient protein coming in before bed or a stimulus to initiate MPS shortly after waking, the baseline continues to decline. The data on overnight muscle loss. Let's put some numbers around this. Studies using stable isotope tracer techniques have shown that overnight fasting results in a net negative protein balance for skeletal muscle. Muscle protein breakdown increases while synthesis rates drop due to the absence of circulating amino acids. In one study, older adults who consumed no protein before bed exhibited significantly more overnight muscle degradation compared to those who received a dose of casein protein. This tells us something important. Catabolism during sleep is not inevitable, it's conditional on nutrient availability. Now, you might be wondering, can we just eat more during the day and carry over those nutrients through the night? Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Amino acids are not stored in the body the way glucose or fat are. They circulate briefly and then they're either used, oxidized, or excreted. That means you can't eat a high-protein lunch and expect it to protect your muscle overnight. By bedtime, your plasma amino acid levels are long gone, your body is running on empty unless you do something about it. The power of pre-sleep protein. This brings us to protein timing, and specifically, pre-sleep protein feeding, a strategy that's gaining traction in the clinical nutrition and exercise science literature. A number of randomized trials have demonstrated that consuming 30 to 40 grams of slow-digesting protein, usually casein, 30 to 60 minutes before bed can significantly enhance overnight muscle protein synthesis, especially in older adults. Why casein? Casein is a dairy-derived protein that digests slowly and forms a gel-like substance in the stomach, resulting in a slow and sustained release of amino acids into the bloodstream over a 6 to 8 hour period. In contrast, whey protein, while excellent post-workout, digests quickly and doesn't maintain elevated amino acid levels throughout the night. We've discussed anabolic resistance before. Simply put, older muscles don't respond to amino acids with the same vigor they once did. It takes more protein, more leucine, and more thoughtful timing to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, MPS, which brings us to casein. Casein is one of two primary proteins found in milk, the other being whey. While both are complete proteins and rich in essential amino acids, they differ significantly in how they behave once ingested. Whey protein is rapidly digested, peaking plasma amino acid levels within about an hour. That makes it ideal post-workout, when you want a fast, sharp spike in MPS. But its effects are short-lived. By 2 to 3 hours, plasma amino acid levels are back to baseline. It's a sprint. Casein, the marathon protein for overnight recovery. Casein, on the other hand, is a marathon. When consumed, casein forms a gel-like structure in the stomach, slowing gastric emptying and resulting in a slow, steady release of amino acids into the bloodstream. 0.5 plasma amino acid levels remain elevated for up to 7 hours, providing a sustained anabolic environment that directly counteracts the typical overnight catabolic drift. This is precisely what makes casein the gold standard for pre-sleep protein. It mimics what your body needs during sleep, a slow drip of amino acids to minimize muscle protein breakdown, MPB6, and support low-level MPS throughout the night. This isn't just theory, it's been tested repeatedly in the lab. In a 2012 study published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, researchers looked at older men consuming 40 grams of casein protein before bed. The results: a significant increase in overnight muscle protein synthesis compared to a placebo group. More importantly, the amino acids were indeed being digested and absorbed during sleep, a key proof point that late-night protein is not wasted or unutilized, as some have feared. 7 Follow-up studies confirmed that pre-sleep casein not only improves overnight muscle preservation but can enhance muscle mass and strength gains over time when combined with resistance training. That means it's not just protective, it's actively anabolic in the right context. The non-negotiable role of muscle. Let me pause here and emphasize something. If your goal is longevity with function, not just more years, but more capable years, then muscle preservation is non-negotiable. The biggest threat to late-life independence is loss of mobility, and that begins with loss of strength, which begins with loss of muscle. You cannot afford to ignore even modest, repeated losses, especially overnight when the body is most vulnerable. Practical application: how much casein? So, the obvious question becomes, how much casein should you consume? The research points to a minimum effective dose of about 30 grams, with 40 grams being optimal for most older adults. 8 This provides sufficient leucine to stimulate MPS and ensures that circulating amino acids remain available through the night. It can come from a casein protein supplement, micellar casein is the ideal form, or from whole food sources like cottage cheese or Greek yogurt. Though reaching 30 to 40 grams from food alone can be impractical for many people, especially if they're managing total caloric intake or appetite late at night. That's where supplementation becomes a powerful tool, not a crutch, but a strategic intervention. Addressing common concerns. Now, what about potential downsides? Some people worry that consuming protein before bed will impair sleep, cause GI upset, or lead to fat gain. 9 The literature doesn't support these concerns, at least not when using casein in the right dose. In fact, most trials show no significant impact on sleep quality, and in some cases, participants report improved recovery and reduced soreness the next day. As for fat gain, protein has a high thermic effect, supports lean mass, and promotes satiety. If anything, it's the least likely macronutrient to contribute to fat accumulation, especially when paired with resistance training. So, what's the protocol I typically recommend to patients focused on preserving muscle into their 60s, 70s, and beyond? Consume 30 to 40 grams of casein protein 30 to 40 minutes before bed. 1 Choose a slow-digesting form, micellar casein is ideal. If using food, low-fat cottage cheese or Greek yogurt are good options, but verify the protein content. You often need a large portion. Pair this with adequate total daily protein intake, ideally 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, depending on your level of activity and body composition. Distribute that protein evenly across 3 to 4 meals, combined with resistance training at least 2 to 3 times per week to generate the stimulus for muscle protein synthesis. These strategies work synergistically. Casein alone won't build muscle, it merely protects against overnight loss. But when combined with resistance exercise and proper total protein intake, it closes a gap that would otherwise undermine your efforts. Think of it this way: each night, you either reinforce your muscle tissue or you allow it to erode. There is no neutral state. Over weeks, months, and years, the consequences of that decision become visible in your posture, your gait, your strength, and your independence. Casein protein before bed is not a trendy hack or a sports nutrition gimmick. It is a clinical tool, one that aligns with physiology, one that fills a critical metabolic gap, one that can help you walk into your 80s and 90s not with frailty, but with power, control, and autonomy. This is the essence of proactive longevity: small, intelligent choices that compound over time. Casein protein before bed is one of them. Muscle loss, a medical, not cosmetic, issue. There's a misconception I encounter frequently: the idea that losing muscle as we age is a cosmetic issue, purely aesthetic. I hear people say things like, "I'm just not as strong as I used to be," or "I've lost some muscle." But that's normal, right? As if the worst outcome is a softer appearance or less definition in the mirror. This couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, muscle mass, and more importantly, muscle function, is among the most predictive biomarkers we have for long-term health and longevity. Point 2. The loss of muscle tissue in aging, a condition known clinically as sarcopenia, is not benign. It is a harbinger of decline, a marker for increasing risk of falls, fractures, impaired glucose regulation, immune dysfunction, hospitalizations, and yes, even death. The data speaks, muscle as a predictor of longevity. Let's look at the data. A 2014 meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Medicine found that low muscle mass in older adults was independently associated with all-cause mortality, even after adjusting for confounders like age, BMI, and comorbidities. Point 3. Another study from the Journal of the American Geriatric Society showed that older adults with sarcopenia were significantly more likely to experience functional impairment, institutionalization, and early mortality. And it's not just mass, it's strength and power that matter most. Take grip strength, for example. This simple, low-tech measure has emerged as one of the strongest independent predictors of mortality across diverse populations. In the PURE study, which included over 140,000 individuals from 17 countries, lower grip strength was associated with a 17% increased risk of all-cause mortality per 5 kg decrement, more predictive than systolic blood pressure in some subgroups. Think about that. Your ability to squeeze a dynamometer, a proxy for overall muscle function, tells us more about your risk of death than your blood pressure. That's how consequential muscle is. The mechanistic link, why muscle matters so much. But why does this matter so much? What's the mechanistic link? There are several. First, muscle is your primary reservoir for glucose disposal. It contains the largest number of insulin-sensitive GLUT4 receptors, meaning it's where the majority of postprandial glucose goes. Less muscle means poorer glycemic control, higher circulating insulin levels, and a faster march toward insulin resistance, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes, all of which accelerate aging at the cellular level. Second, muscle plays a vital role in systemic inflammation and immune regulation. Skeletal muscle secretes myokines, cytokines with anti-inflammatory properties, during contraction. These myokines can inhibit pro-inflammatory signaling, improve metabolic flexibility, and support immune competence. When muscle mass declines, you lose that protective endocrine function. In essence, less muscle means more chronic inflammation, a key driver of nearly every chronic disease we associate with aging. Third, muscle protects your skeletal integrity. Loss of muscle means loss of mechanical load on bones, leading to decreased bone mineral density. That's one reason sarcopenia and osteoporosis often go hand in hand. The combination is deadly. A fall that might bruise a healthy 40-year-old can shatter the hip of a frail 80-year-old. And the 1-year mortality after hip fracture in the elderly exceeds 30%, not because the fracture itself is always lethal, but because of what it represents, the tipping point into immobility, infection, and metabolic collapse. And fourth, and this is crucial, muscle is a buffer for physiological stress. It's the tissue you catabolize when fighting illness, recovering from surgery, or fasting during hospitalization. If you don't have adequate reserves, your body starts breaking down critical proteins, organs, and immune cells. In cancer patients, this is called cachexia, but the same principles apply more broadly. Muscle mass is a reserve of survivability. The term I use with patients is physiological capital. You want as much of it as possible entering your 60s and 70s, because every illness, every hospitalization, every period of bed rest is a withdrawal. If your account is empty, recovery is compromised. If it's robust, you bounce back. The path to proactive longevity. This brings us full circle to our earlier point, nighttime catabolism. If you're losing muscle during sleep, a process that accelerates with age, inactivity, and undernutrition, you're steadily eroding that capital 1 gram at a time. And if you're not doing anything to reverse or blunt that loss, especially in the critical overnight window, you're passively accelerating your decline. Now, imagine the opposite scenario. You've made muscle preservation a priority. You lift heavy things a few times a week. You eat sufficient protein, distributed evenly throughout the day. You consume a slow-digesting protein like casein before bed to provide amino acids during the long overnight fast. You sleep well, recover well, and remain physically active. That person, even if they're 75 or 80, is far more likely to retain independence, avoid hospitalizations, and maintain cognitive and metabolic function. Not because they're lucky, but because they've stacked the odds in their favor by protecting the most important tissue in aging, skeletal muscle. Let me be blunt, when I look at an older adult who is frail, hunched, and slow-moving, I don't just see a physical decline. I see metabolic risk, fall risk, immune vulnerability, reduced mitochondrial capacity, and a sharply elevated risk of death in the next 5 to 10 years. Sarcopenia is not a symptom, it's a signal, and we ignore it at our peril. Fortunately, it's also modifiable. Muscle is one of the few tissues you can add back with the right inputs, even into your 80s and 90s. But you have to be proactive. You can't wait until you're weak and immobile to start. Then, you can't rely on vague ideas like eat enough or stay active. The approach has to be precise, because anabolic resistance in aging makes the margin for error smaller. And that's what makes interventions like pre-sleep casein so valuable. It's one of the most targeted tools we have to blunt the catabolic effects of overnight fasting at precisely the time when the aging body is least capable of defending itself. It's not a magic bullet, but it's an important brick in the wall. If you care about being able to get up off the floor unassisted at 85, walk your dog at 90, or simply avoid the cascade of decline that begins with muscle loss, then this kind of intervention isn't optional, it's foundational. This is the difference between lifespan and health span, and ultimately, it's the difference between surviving aging and thriving through it. The Nighttime Protocol, Blunting Overnight Muscle Catabolism. Understanding that muscle loss is not just a cosmetic concern but a metabolic liability and a predictor of mortality, the question naturally becomes, what can we do about it? In my practice, when I work with patients, particularly those over the age of 50, one of the most impactful yet underappreciated interventions we deploy is a structured nighttime protocol designed to mitigate overnight muscle catabolism. The goal isn't simply to slow down muscle loss, it's to preserve function, improve metabolic flexibility, and ultimately extend health span. Let's walk through exactly how that protocol looks. The cornerstone of the protocol is protein timing and quality, specifically delivering a slow-digesting, leucine-rich protein source just before bed. Why? Because the overnight fast, typically 7 to 9 hours, is a time when muscle protein synthesis, MPS, drops and muscle protein breakdown, MPB, predominates. This imbalance shifts older adults, already prone to anabolic resistance, into a deeper catabolic state. You can't fully eliminate MPB during sleep, but you can blunt it, and in many cases, partially reverse the net negative balance by ensuring a sustained amino acid supply during this window. That's where micellar casein protein comes in. Micellar casein is the ideal protein for this task for 2 reasons. 1, it digests slowly, forming a gel in the stomach, leading to a gradual release of amino acids into the bloodstream over 6 to 7 hours. 2, it is rich in leucine, the amino acid most potent in triggering MPS through the mTOR pathway. What we're trying to create is a metabolic state where MPS continues, albeit at a lower amplitude than in the post-exercise window, throughout the night, counterbalancing the inevitable catabolic forces of sleep. Structuring the pre-sleep protein protocol. So here's how I structure the protocol. 1. The pre-sleep protein dose, the optimal dose, according to the literature, is 30 to 40 grams of casein protein consumed about 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime. This provides sufficient total amino acids and exceeds the leucine threshold necessary to stimulate MPS in older adults, typically around 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per feeding in this population. It's important to note, many whey-based proteins will not achieve this effect due to their fast absorption profile. Whey can elevate plasma amino acids quickly, but they fall off within 2 to 3 hours, which is not useful during a prolonged overnight fast. 2. Source of casein. Ideally, we use micellar casein as a supplement. This is the native, unhydrated form that digests slowly. Some people prefer whole food alternatives like cottage cheese or Greek yogurt, and while these are useful, achieving a 30 to 40 gram dose of protein from these sources can require fairly large servings. For example, you may need 400 to 500 grams of low-fat cottage cheese to reach the desired threshold. That can be a digestive challenge late at night for many. Therefore, I often recommend a high-quality micellar casein protein supplement, minimal ingredients, low in sugar, ideally third-party tested. A scoop in water or blended with a small amount of unsweetened almond milk is typically sufficient. 3. Resistance training timing. To truly maximize the effect of pre-sleep casein, it's best paired with resistance training performed earlier in the day. While the anabolic window is more flexible than once believed, performing resistance exercise within 6 to 8 hours of your evening protein feeding enhances muscle sensitivity to amino acids. If you train in the afternoon or early evening, that casein dose becomes the second hit, reinforcing the adaptive response to the mechanical stimulus of training. It's a 1-2 punch, mechanical load followed by sustained amino acid delivery during sleep. Sleep hygiene and total protein intake. Some patients worry that eating before bed will interfere with sleep. That can be true, particularly if the meal is large, high in fat, or paired with high glycemic carbohydrates. But casein protein, taken in liquid form or from a modest whole food source, has not been shown to impair sleep quality. In fact, in several studies, pre-sleep protein intake improved next-day recovery and reduced DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. To minimize any potential disruption, keep the pre-sleep feeding small, under 200 to 250 calories, avoid high-fat accompaniments, avoid stimulants or sugar within 3 to 4 hours of sleep, and make sure your last training session ends at least 2 hours before bed. This protocol doesn't work in isolation. Total daily protein matters, too. The pre-sleep casein dose is one piece of a larger strategy that includes overall daily protein intake, resistance training, and overall energy balance. I recommend most older adults aim for 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed evenly across 3 to 4 meals. Why the even distribution? Because of anabolic resistance, the blunted MPS response to a given dose of protein with aging. By hitting the leucine threshold, around 2.5 grams, multiple times per day, you maximize the number of MPS pulses, allowing for better maintenance or accrual of lean mass. Consistency, automation, and the bigger picture. Compliance and sustainability are key. This protocol works, but only if it's consistent. For that reason, I advise patients to make it as frictionless as possible. Set a reminder on your phone, keep a casein shake ready in the fridge, or stack it with your evening routine, brushing your teeth, taking your magnesium, or other supplements. The goal is automation, make it easy to do, hard to forget. And remember, this isn't just a bodybuilding tactic. This is about preventing frailty, reducing glucose excursions, improving mitochondrial density, and maintaining independence. Because the reality is, no one cares how jacked you were at 40. What matters is whether you can pick yourself up off the floor at 85. That's the metric that counts. And to that end, the nighttime muscle preservation protocol is one of the most effective, evidence-backed, low-cost tools we have. It's simple, it's physiologically aligned, and when used consistently, it has the potential to preserve strength, function, and metabolic health well into advanced age. In summary, building anti-fragility. In summary, consume 30 to 40 grams of micellar casein 30 to 60 minutes before bed. Pair it with resistance training during the day. Maintain total daily protein intake of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, distributed evenly. Ensure sleep is protected by minimizing meal size and sugar near bedtime. Make it consistent. This is a long game. This is how we build anti-fragility into aging, not by waiting for problems to arise, but by targeting the known failure points of physiology and reinforcing them long before they break. This is medicine practiced at the edge of what's possible, where health span, not just lifespan, is the metric that matters.